We've seen that a theory of justice has to do a lot of work, not least providing an answer to the question, why be just? It shouldn't take our moral intuitions for granted, but it also shouldn't ignore them. And a theory of justice should definitely say something constructive about cases where our deeply held intuitions come into conflict. Now, many of these theories can be sorted into two broad camps: consequentialist theories and deontological accounts. Now, varieties of utilitarianism are the most obvious examples of the former, rights-based approaches, examples of the latter. Are these traditions necessarily opposed? John Stuart Mill contributed a remarkable attempt to protect freedoms while still appealing to desirable consequences, the principle of utility. That principle for Mill was still to be the ultimate arbiter of right and wrong, but this was not a crude hedonistic approach to utility. Mill appeals to a rich account of happiness that's linked to the exercise of our distinctive human powers, of rational, moral, and aesthetic creativity and discernment. Now, as we'll see, that's ultimately where the difficulties start for Mill. What if I value liberty regardless of this flourishing and happiness? Who made Mill, or you, or me, the ultimate arbiter of a good life, a life well lived? Now, Mill's concern in his essay on liberty is a decidedly modern concern. He is not primarily concerned with, say, justifying the state, or property rights, or reining in the power of kings and emperors. His primary concern is a different kind of tyranny, the tyranny of the majority, enforced by law and custom. How can we protect personal freedom against this kind of tyranny? Now, we could appeal to inalienable rights, as Locke did. We could appeal to the sources of duty that inhere in our dignity as beings who have a rational moral character. And that was Kant's view. Now, Mill rejects any such appeal to rights and duties as the ultimate arbiter. He's a utilitarian, but he still thinks we can justify liberty by virtue of the consequences of freedom. And we only interfere with that freedom to prevent harm to others. And this is Mill's one simple principle. But what counts as a harm, and who decides? For Mill, we harm one another for the purposes of justifying interference only if we violate a distinct and assignable obligation. Simply pointing out that actions often have a range of indirect and often unintended consequences, well, that may help us think about the complexities of social life, certainly. But that's not sufficient to justify interference in the name of the public interest. Nor, Mill thinks, can we justify interference by appealing to our greater insight and our desire to help others. I may be convinced I know what's best, how you should live your life, how I should live my life. That may tempt me to interfere in your life choices. And my claim is I'm interfering in your best interests. But that's unacceptable on Mill's harm principle. You can't restrict freedom simply because you believe someone to be, in Mill's famous phrasing, foolish, perverse, or wrong. Mill gives the example here of someone who deliberately seeks to offend. If you blatantly eat meat in front of a vegan, say. Now, your actions may be boorish and obnoxious. In some plausible sense, they might be wrong. Perhaps the vegan is correct, that your unreflective culinary preferences are contributing to widespread cruelty and ecological devastation. But regardless, you haven't harmed the vegan in Mill's estimation. How does this one simple principle enhance utility then? After all, if the vegan is right about the environmental and moral consequences of meat eating, then doesn't Mill's harm principle prevent us from addressing this and other negative externalities, as the economists would label them? These are cases where no one person is directly at fault, but together our actions may harm everyone. Mill offers two arguments here for his harm principle. The first appeals to the greater utility of truth. The second, to a greater utility associated with human flourishing. Let's consider each argument in turn. Even if we're inclined to agree with Mill that typically the truth is more valuable than falsehood, we should probably begin that argument by acknowledging how new technologies have complicated any straightforward hope that the truth will inevitably prevail over distortions and falsehoods. Mill asks for a vibrant public sphere in which people are free to express themselves without fear of censorship, or what we might today call getting cancelled. We need a vigorous and sustained contest of ideas, Mill thinks, and those viewpoints have to be passionately defended by committed advocates. They can't simply be presented as a kind of devil's advocate position by people who don't really believe in the positions they're defending. And even if most of us are convinced of the truth, if we suppress those alternative viewpoints, we rob others of the opportunity to learn the truth by this encounter of truth with falsehood. But I doubt Mill could have imagined today's world where this radically democratic and inclusive array of technologies has essentially been weaponized to distort and manipulate complex truths, which unfortunately propagate through social networks much less effectively than well-tailored, simple distortions or outright falsehoods. And does it even make sense to say that truth always have a higher utility than falsehoods? Think of Magritte's wonderful painting, The Treachery of Images. Is that painting a true or a false expression? And does it matter to why we think artistic expression is so deserving of protection? A more recent example, Childish Gambino's compelling 2018 video for his song This Is America. It arguably expresses important and damning judgments about policing in America and the complicity of the entertainment industry in the continuing marginalization and suppression of a full range of Black American voices. But would we say that the importance of this expression turns on the utility of those complicated and contested truths? And there's another layer to this particular example. There was a dispute over the similarities between This Is America and Jas Harley's song American Pharaoh. Now, we might care about the answer as a kind of point of intellectual curiosity or intellectual property, but does the value of these respective pieces of art depend on the truth of those charges? I'd argue it doesn't. And finally, consider the case of Paul Robert Cohen, who in 1968 was sentenced to 30 days in county jail for offensive conduct under Section 415 of the California Penal Code. His offense was to walk into and sit down in the Los Angeles County Courthouse, not in a courtroom, but in the courthouse, wearing a jacket emblazoned with the expression, "fuck the draft." Now, this is arguably critical political speech. Is it true? Well, maybe we could come up with a story about how this simple, evocative expression captures deeper truths about state abuse of military powers and the power of the draft. Sure, but it can't be why we think that kind of political expression demands protection. It demands protection because it's vital political expression in a free and fair democratic society. And finally, it doesn't seem that hard, especially this day and age, to imagine truths that might not have higher utility than pleasing falsehoods. If an asteroid is about to destroy the Earth in a matter of days or even hours, the resulting chaos from revealing that truth might cause even more harm than the impending apocalypse. Social breakdown might make those last days even more violent and terrifying for everyone. Now, against that worry, you might argue that people deserve to live their life, however long or short it will be on this earth. They deserve to live their life with full information so they can make informed choices about how they want to spend, say, those last days before the apocalypse. Now, that seems a plausible position, but notice that the greater utility of truth in that argument depends on our already believing that people should live their lives in a fully informed way. So the greater utility of truth argument, in this case, would only persuade if we were already committed to a convincing story about what the truth is good for. Mill's second argument provides just that sort of account. It's a defense of liberties of tastes and pursuits that tells us what truth is good for. It's good for flourishing as individuals. When we live our lives in freedom, making our own choices and our own mistakes, We enjoy a richer, higher sort of pleasure associated with these distinctively human faculties. So these experiments in living, Mill argues, link personal freedom with favorable consequences. For instance, what the truth would be good for. Well, it's good for human flourishing. Now for Mill, that flourishing happens when we exercise those distinctively human capacities linked in his other work with higher quality pleasures. On this view, happiness is tightly bound with exercising our individuality, not slavishly conforming to the dictates and norms of society. We engage in these experiments in living, as Mill calls them. Still, if your utilitarianism depends on this prior commitment to an account of better ways of living, I think it's questionable whether you're really committed to utilitarianism. It seems to me that instead you're a moral perfectionist. And that moral perfection then gives you a way to evaluate consequences. But the consequences are only valuable according to your favored vision of a life well lived. And I think a lot of liberals, certainly libertarians, are likely to balk at this and suspect that Mill was on the right track with the harm principle, leave me alone, but was led astray by his utilitarianism to this attention to a life well lived and human flourishing. You don't need that. Don't tell me how to live, just leave me alone. Now, one way to rescue Mill's argument would be to insist that we don't need to agree on what counts as a good life. We only need to agree on what counts as unambiguous harm. But remember that for Mill, harm is a very concise and constrained idea. It actually seems to allow considerable disagreement over cumulative and indirect harms, like environmental damage across generations. So if this approach to rescuing Mill is to succeed, it's probably going to involve constraining the harm principle to very specific cases where we can agree unambiguously on what counts as harm. And as we'll see, Peter Singer and Hugh La Follette, in different ways, both pursue something like this strategy. For both of them, their arguments rely heavily on moral analogies. If you think that was a clear case of harm, then why not this?